By going back in time, you can trace back the ancient civilizations to the first cities in 3000 BC. 4 cities developed along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq. Farming with canals allowed for mass production of food. This fed cities where the citizens could develop their culture, including writing, religion, science and the arts. Looking at the world from 3000 BC to 500 BC, there was a constant expansion and contraction of kingdoms. For many centuries cities were settled, and as many grew, they waged war on their neighbors to increase their power and wealth. In 1200 BC the Egyptians reached the height of their civilization, covering much of the southeastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. 7 centuries later, the Persian Empire was many times larger than the Egyptian Empire, spanning from India to Greece. It was also larger than the Roman Empire, which peaked 7 centuries after the Persians. In 484 BC, Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus, and as such he was a subject of the Persian Empire. But he spent much of his adult life in Athens and traveling the seas as a merchant. Herodotus wrote the first history book ever written in the 5th century BC, simply titled the Histories. Nearly 900 pages, it's told in his words, and captures the customs and events of his day. It's a unique perspective on how the Greeks, known then as the Hellenes, took on the mighty Persian Empire. Herodotus gives us a history lesson like none other. The first passage presented here is from 560 BC. Herodotus tells the story of Astyages, king of Media, and his grandson Cyrus, who went on to be first king of the Persian Empire in 549 BC.
Astyages, king of Media, had a dream in which he saw a vine growing from his daughter's genitals and covering all of Asia. He consulted the dream interpreters and then he sent for his daughter to come to him. She was with child, and after her arrival he kept a close watch on her because he intended to kill the child she would bear. For the dream interpreters had revealed to him his daughter's child would replace Astyages as king.
After its birth, the king gave the newborn son named Cyrus to a servant to kill. Ultimately, however, Cyrus was not killed, and when in his teens King Astyages learned that Cyrus was alive.
King Astyages summoned the same dream interpreters he had sought before the birth of Cyrus, explaining, "The boy has survived and is alive today, but while he was dwelling in the country the boys of the village made him king in their game, and he performed all the functions that real kings do." The dream interpreters said, "If the boy still lives and has become king in some unforeseen way, you have nothing to fear from him since he will not rule a second time." Astyages agreed, saying, "When the boy was given the title of king the dream was fulfilled, and I have no reason to fear him any longer."
King Astyages was dethroned by Cyrus in 550 BC. Cyrus conquered Media, becoming the first Persian king of Asia, reigning for 20 years from 550 to 530 BC. Cyrus died in 530 BC. His son, Cambyses, became king of Persia. Cambyses had a grievance with the king of Egypt, Amasis. To test Amasis, Cambyses asked for his daughter to own as a concubine. King Amasis, not willing to give up his daughter, devised a plan by dressing another woman and sending her to Persia.
After a while, when Cambyses kept treating the girl as the daughter of Amasis, she said to him, "Sire, you have no idea how you have been duped by Amasis. He decked me out in finery and sent me off to you on the pretense that he was giving up his own daughter, when in reality I am the daughter of Apries, his former master, whom he murdered when the Egyptians revolted." And so, according to the Persians, it was this little speech that caused Cambyses, son of Cyrus, to become extremely enraged with Egypt.
After conquering Egypt, King Cambyses returned to Persia, where he died from an accidental, self-inflicted spear wound. In the chaos following the death of King Cambyses, Darius and 6 others conspired to seize control of Persia from 2 Magi rulers who had taken the crown. They murdered the bodyguards and killed the Magi.
After Darius and the conspirators had killed both Magi, they cut off their heads and ran outside carrying the heads of the Magi. There, with great shouts, they called out to the other Persians, describing all that had happened and showing them the heads. The Persians decided it was right for them to join the killing too, so, drawing their daggers they slew every Magi they found. The Persians commemorate this day as their most important public holiday and celebrate it with a great festival they call the Murder of the Magi.
Darius applied his cunning to tricking his co-conspirators into proclaiming Darius as king of Persia. The Persians under Darius conquered and plundered the island of Samos, leaving it without a living inhabitant. While Darius was focused on Samos, the Babylonians revolted in 522 BC.
The Babylonians had prepared for this rebellion well in advance, making preparations for a siege. When they did revolt openly, each man set aside his mother and one woman he selected from his household to prepare his food. These women were saved. All the other women were brought together and strangled in order to prevent them from consuming the food supply. When Darius learned about the revolt, he collected his entire army and launched a campaign against the Babylonians. When he arrived there, he laid siege to the city, but the Babylonians were not worried. One of them was heard to proclaim, "Why do you sit there, Persians, instead of going away? For you will not conquer us until mules give birth." Of course, he never expected that a mule would give birth. A year and 7 months passed, and Darius became quite distressed when he found that his entire army could not manage to take Babylon. Then, in the 20th month, Zophiros, the son of one of Darius's co-conspirators, could think of no way to subdue the city except by mutilating himself and going over to the Babylonians as a deserter. He proceeded to mutilate himself irreversibly. He cut off his own nose and ears, as well as whipped himself, and then went to Darius. When Darius saw his most eminent man so mutilated, he was horrified. Zophiros explained, "I shall go as I am to the war posing as a deserter and claim that I have suffered this abuse at your hands. I think my condition will convince them that what I say is true, and that they will then give me command of an army."
Zophiros' plan worked, and Darius conquered the Babylonians. They never recovered from the devastation brought upon Babylon by the Persians. Nearly 30 years after destroying Babylon, the Persians continued their war against the Hellenes, defeating the cities of Thrace as they moved west along the north shore of the Aegean Sea.
Darius tried to test the Hellenes to find out whether they intended to wage war against him or to surrender to him. He sent out messengers in all directions throughout Greece and ordered them to ask for earth and water for the king. He sent other messengers to his tribute-paying cities along the coast with orders to build warships and vessels to transport horses. So the cities began to construct these ships. On the mainland, many of the Hellenes visited by the messengers gave what the Persian asked, as did all the islanders. Darius wanted to subjugate all those Hellenes who had refused to offer tribute to him. He appointed generals and sent them off, instructing them to enslave Athens and Eretria, and to bring back the captive slaves into his presence. The Eretrians had no intention of marching out to meet the Persians in battle, so now their prevailing plan was to stay in the city. Their main concern was to defend its walls if they possibly could. The assault on the walls was fierce and lasted for 6 days, and many fell on both sides. On the 7th day, 2 prominent citizens betrayed their city and surrendered it to the Persians. After entering the city, the Persians plundered and set fire to the sanctuaries, and as Darius had instructed, they enslaved the people. As soon as the Athenians heard about this, they rushed to Marathon to defend it themselves, led by 10 generals. The first thing the generals did was to send a message to Sparta. They sent it by dispatching Philippides, who was an Athenian long-distance runner and a professional in this work. When Philippides arrived in Sparta, some 26 miles from Marathon, he proclaimed, "The Athenians beg you to rush to their defense and not look on passively as the most ancient city in Greece falls into slavery, imposed by barbarians."
The Spartans agreed to help, but not until their festival ended. The Athenians stood alone in Marathon, awaiting the Persian navy. The Persians landed a much larger army than the Greeks, and faced off against the Athenians, across the plain of Marathon.
The Athenians' deployment at Marathon had the line of the Athenian army equal in length to the Persians. But the center of the Athenian line was only a few rows deep, and thus the army was at its weakest there. Each wing, however, was strong in numbers. the Athenians let loose and charged to run toward the barbarians. The space between the two armies was about a mile, and the Persians, who saw the Athenians advancing toward them on the double, prepared to meet their attack. They assumed that the Athenians were seized by some utterly self-destructive madness. But when the Athenians closed with them in combat, they fought remarkably well. For they were the first of all Hellenes we know of to use the running charge against their enemies. They fought in the battle of Marathon for a long time. The barbarians prevailed in the center of the line, but at the same time the Athenians were prevailing on the wings. Drawing both of their wings together, they fought those enemy troops who had broken through the center. The Athenians were victorious and the Persians fled. The Athenians pursued them and cut them down until they reached the sea, where they seized 7 ships. The other ships returned to Asia. In the Battle of Marathon, about 6,400 of the barbarians died, and of the Athenians, 192.
This photo is of the Soros, the extraordinary burial mound built over the graves of the Athenian troops who died at Marathon. Originally it stood 45 feet high and 100 feet in diameter.
When the report of the Battle of Marathon reached Darius, he now reacted with a much more intense fury and became even more determined to make war on Greece than he had been before. At once he began to issue commands to the cities of the empire with instructions to each of them to provide a great deal more than they had provided previously, including horses, food, warships and transport boats. The announcement of these orders threw Asia into commotion for 3 years, as the best men were enlisted to serve in the army and to make preparations for war against others. Then in the 4th year, the Egyptians revolted from the Persians, which only increased Darius' desire to go to war, but now against both peoples. Darius was fated to die in the midst of his preparations and was thus deprived of the opportunity to punish the Egyptians and Athenians. He had reigned a total of 36 years, and at his death the kingship was assumed by his son, Xerxes.
In 484 BC, Xerxes completed his father's goal of defeating the Egyptian revolt. That same year, Herodotus was born on the eastern shores of the Aegean Sea.
After conquering Egypt, Xerxes intended to undertake the expedition against Athens. He said, "I intend to bridge the Hellespont and lead my army through Europe to Greece, so that we can punish the Athenians for all that they did to the Persians and to my father. I shall not give up until I conquer Athens and set it on fire, since it is they who began offenses against me and my father. I suppose you know what they did to us when our troops disembarked onto their land near Marathon." During 4 full years following the conquest of Egypt, Xerxes prepared his army and gathered provisions for it. Then, in the 5th year, he set out on his campaign with an enormous body of troops. In fact, of all the expeditions we know of, this was by far the largest.
Like Darius before him, the greatest challenge Xerxes faced in leading his army to Greece was crossing the Hellespont. At its narrowest point, 1,350 yards separate the two banks of the Hellespont. Xerxes' slaves spent years building boat bridges across it, in preparation for the army and its support. The first pair of boat bridges fell victim to a storm. Xerxes had the waters of the Hellespont whipped, and the supervisors of the bridge were beheaded. New boat bridges were built.
They set together 360 boats parallel to the current, using cables to keep them together. They let down very large anchors to offset the winds. When the straits had thus been bridged, they sawed wood into planks whose length matched the width of the bridge of boats, and tied them in place. Next they placed brushwood on top and stamped down soil on top of it. Finally, they extended a fence along each side so that the beasts of burden and the horses would not look out to the sea below and panic. When they reached the bridge at Abdos, Xerxes wanted to review his entire army. He ordered an elevated throne of marble to be made and set up on a hill in advance. And there he sat, gazing down at the shore, viewing his army and his ships. As he looked out over the whole Hellespont, whose water was completely hidden by all his ships, and at all the shores and the plains of Abdos, now so full of people, Xerxes congratulated himself for being so blessed. But then he suddenly burst into tears and wept. When asked why, Xerxes said, I was suddenly overcome by pity as I considered the brevity of human life, since not one of all these people here will be alive 100 years from now. The next morning, Xerxes led his army across the two bridges. The infantry and cavalry on one bridge, the beasts of burden and the train of servants on the other bridge. The first to go over were the 10,000 Persians. It took the whole day for these men to make the crossing. The first to go over on the next day were the horsemen, and the troops who were holding their spears pointed downward. Then came the sacred horses and the sacred chariot, followed by Xerxes himself, his spear-bearers and 1,000 horsemen, and after these, the rest of the army marched over. At the same time, the ships were sailing for the opposite shore. It took the army 7 days and 7 nights without pause to cross the bridges. The total number of warships, light boats and horse transport boats came to 3,000. Regarding the Persian army, the number of infantry came to 1,700,000, and the cavalry amounted to 80,000. The numbers from the fleet and support, combined with the land army, come to the total Persian force at over 5 million men. The Hellenes deliberated about how, and where, they would wage the war. The opinion that prevailed was to defend the pass at Thermopylae, since they saw that it was narrow, and concluded that the barbarians would not be able to exploit the great number of their infantry, or cavalry, on this terrain. The Hellenes planned to defend this pass in an attempt to keep the barbarians out of Greece. They have their fleet sail to Artemision so that their land and sea forces would be close enough to keep informed about each other's status. The Persian fleet sailed to the beach of Magnesia. The first ships to arrive moored close to the beach, while the others lay at anchor farther offshore. Out of the clear and windless sky, the sea suddenly began to seethe, and a violent storm with a strong east wind fell upon them. Some of the ships caught out on the high sea were carried to shore at the rocks, or were wrecked. This storm lasted 4 days, and was indeed an overwhelming disaster. The rest of the barbarian fleet arrived at Aphetai. At the same time, King Xerxes and his army were camped at the pass near Thermopylae. The Hellenes who were waiting for the Persians in this region were 300 Spartan hoplites, joined by a few thousand men from Greek cities nearby. The most admired and the leader of the whole army was the Spartan king, Leonidas. Xerxes let 4 whole days elapse, all the while expecting that the Hellenes would run away. But when, on the 5th day, he lost his temper and ordered the army out against them, with instructions to bring them back alive. The Persians charged headlong into the Hellenes, and great numbers of them fell. The Hellenes made it clear to everyone, and especially to the king himself, that although there were many in his army, there were few real men. The fighting went on all day. The king was at a loss about how to deal with this dilemma. But just then a local man came to speak with him, expecting to win some great reward for telling the king of the path that led through the mountain to Thermopylae. By so doing, he caused the destruction of the Hellenes stationed there. At sunrise, Xerxes made his attack. Xerxes' men advanced, but so did the Hellenes with King Leonidas. Since the latter were marching to their death, they now ventured much farther than they had. Many of the barbarians fell, for the leaders of the regiments were behind them with whips, flogging each and every man and urging them forward. Many fell into the sea and died, but even more were trampled alive by one another. There was no counting the number of dead. And it was during this struggle that King Leonidas fell, the man who had proved himself the most valiant of all, and with him those other famous Spartans who also proved themselves to be worthy men. They were buried where they had fallen. The Persian fleet which survived the storm were anchored at Aphetai, while the Greek fleet anchored at Artemision. In the battle that ensued, the Greeks took 30 of the barbarians' ships. The contest was still undecided when night fell, and parted to 2 sides. The Hellenes sailed back to Artemision and the barbarians to Aphetai. Evening fell, and although it was the season of midsummer, heavy rains poured down without stopping throughout the entire night, and violent thunder boomed off Mount Pline. Corpses and wreckage were carried to shore at Aphetai, collecting around the prows of the Persian ships and becoming tangled in the blades of the oars. When the Persians heard this, they began to panic, expecting that they would be utterly destroyed. No sea battles took place on the next day, but by the third day, the commanders of the barbarians formed a crescent with their ships and began to encircle the Hellenes in order to trap them. The Hellenes sailed out and engaged them in battle. In this fight, the two sides turned out to be just about an even match for each other. Xerxes' forces failed by reason of their own size and numbers. Their ships chaotically crashed into one another and were wrecked. Many Greek ships and men were lost there, but many more of the barbarians' ships and men were destroyed. When the Hellenes learned that Leonidas and his troops had lost their lives at Thermopylae, they hastily left their cities and gathered together at the isthmus where they established their camp. Their commander was the brother of Leonidas, named Cleombrotus. They built a wall across the isthmus, and since many tens of thousands of men were working on this project, they were making substantial progress. The Greek fleet was attacked by the barbarians off the shores of Salamis. The rest of the Hellenes began to retreat, but an Athenian commander advanced his ship farther out and rammed one of the enemy's vessels. The two ships became entangled, and other Greeks came to help him, and the battle started. Most of Xerxes' ships at Salamis were disabled. For since the Hellenes fought the naval battle in disciplined order and remained in their ranks, while the barbarians failed to hold their positions. In this struggle, the commander Ariobaeneus, son of Darius and brother of Xerxes, lost his life, as did many other notable men of the Persians and their allies. But few of the Hellenes died, for they knew how to swim, so those whose ships were destroyed and were not killed in hand-to-hand combat swam safely to Salamis. Many barbarians drowned in the sea as they did not know how to swim. When Xerxes realized the severity of the disaster that had occurred, he became afraid that someone would advise the Hellenes to sail to the Hellespont and break apart the bridges, so that he would be trapped in Europe and in danger of perishing there. And so, he made plans to flee. Xerxes decided to leave one of his generals, named Mardonios, an army of 300,000 men to conquer the Hellenes at the isthmus. At the king's order, the Persian fleet commanders put out to sea to sail back to the Hellespont, in order to protect the bridges of boats in preparation for the king's journey back home. Xerxes made a swift journey to the Hellespont. He arrived at the passage in 45 days, but did not bring back even a fraction of his army intact. They were starving, forced to devour the grass growing from the ground, and they stripped the bark and plucked the foliage from trees, eating everything and leaving nothing at all behind. Moreover, a plague descended upon the army, and wasted the troops along the way. The Spartans continued their march, now in the company of the Athenians who had come from Salamis. They learned that the barbarians were camping along the Asapo River. They took up positions opposite the enemy on the foothills of Mount Cithaeron. Mardonios learned that the Hellenes were at Plataea, so they also advanced to where the Asapo River flowed. When they arrived there, Mardonios arranged his army of 350,000 men opposite the Hellenes. For 10 days, neither side wanted to initiate battle. The barbarians tested the Hellenes by going as far as the Aspos, but neither side crossed the river. Mardonios charged the Hellenes. Mardonios was mounted on a white horse and surrounded by 1,000 picked men, the best of the Persians, and for as long as he survived, the Persians maintained their resistance and they struck down many Spartans. But when Mardonios was killed, and the troops posted around him who made up the most formidable division of the army had also fallen, the others turned to flee. When the Persians were routed by the Spartans, they fled in disorder to their camp. The Persians took refuge within the wooden wall of their fort. Finally, by valor and perseverance, the Athenians mounted the wall and tore it down, and the Hellenes streamed in. The Hellenes were thus provided with such a great opportunity for slaughter, that out of an army numbering 350,000, not even 3,000 survived. 347,000 Persians perished on the plains and in the fort. Of the Spartans, in all 91 died in this encounter, and of the Athenians, 52.
That year was 479 BC. It was the beginning of the decline of the Persian Empire, for over the following decades their northwestern territory receded. Herodotus was of Greek ancestry, and was 5 years old when the war ended. Herodotus knew firsthand the atrocities of tyranny, as well as the adornment of the heroes. He was well known and liked in Athens, which had become the world's first democracy during the century before his birth. He undoubtedly knew many of the Hellenes who lived in Athens, Sparta and other Greek cities, whose brave men fought and won the Persian Wars to remain free. Herodotus also provided a wonderful perspective on ancient cultures and customs in his book, The Histories. ITM's video on Herodotus, The Histories, Ancient Customs, provides other excerpts from his book, read by my colleague, Peter. Thank you, Peter. View Ancient Customs on YouTube. Thanks for watching this ITM production.